Recording in progress.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's briefing brought to you by States United Democracy Center. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that we will save some time for Q&A at the end. If you have a question, please put your name and your outlet in the chat, and we will call on you to ask your question after we've heard from our speakers. Now I will turn it over to founder and executive chair of the States United Democracy Center, Norm Eisen, to get us started.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our latest on-the-record press briefing from the States United Democracy Center. As you know, we are a nonpartisan organization that focuses on connecting state officials, law enforcement leaders, and pro-democracy partners across this country with the tools and expertise that they need to safeguard our elections and our democracy. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Nevada Attorney General Aaron Ford, Arizona Secretary of State Katie Hobbs, and my States United co-chair, former New Jersey Governor Christine Todd Whitman. They're joining me today to discuss yesterday's SCOTUS decision in Brnovich and what it means going forward for voting rights and the current challenges facing our democracy, especially to our state leaders. The world has now grappled with the text of the decision, and it's time to understand how it will interact going forward with the already perilous landscape of erecting barriers to free and fair voting by all Americans, irrespective of political party. And of course, here at States United, we focus not just on the problem, but on solutions. And you're going to hear a lot about those bipartisan, commonsensical solutions to the crisis that we face. I will, just to set the stage, recap a little bit of analysis about what happened yesterday before we pivot to these larger forward-looking questions. The Brnovich decision was the latest in a long series of anti-voting decisions, most famously until yesterday, Shelby County. This case will now be mentioned in tandem with that notorious decision. Here again, the Supreme Court made it even more difficult to fight racial discrimination at the ballot box. This is coming at a time when more than 40 states have introduced over 300 bills seeking to add barriers to voting. This decision is going to make it harder to challenge those laws. Instead of establishing a clear set of standards for what the Voting Rights Act bars, the majority sent a message about the 5 very difficult to meet factors in practice that can save a bad anti-voting law from the Voting Rights Act. Imposing inconvenience on voters is okay. The fact that something was widespread in 1982 when this bill passed applies and makes it difficult to challenge voting laws using Section 2, just like my jump shot in 1982. Voting is also pretty changed today. More's the pity. The disparate impact on minority, elderly, and disabled populations is going to need to be much larger before courts can take notice. Looking at the entire voting system is required, and the state's interest in regulating elections is now subject to very little skepticism. So 5 factors, all spun in a negative fashion by the Supreme Court yesterday. So what does it all mean? 1, the case makes it much harder to challenge things on Voting Rights Act Section 2 grounds. It was once a sharp tool. It's now been blunted. at least for disparate impact cases, but at least it hasn't been tossed aside as it was in Shelby. Two, the court did leave some doors open. Section 2's constitutionality remains in place. That means Congress can still act. And this was a disparate impact case, but the other kind of case under Section 2, discriminatory intent, where you can prove, like in the case just filed by DOJ in Georgia, where the litigants can prove that there was discriminatory intent so blatant in that Georgia statute targeting African American and other voters of color, and that is still on the table. That's why it's so important to take this as an opportunity, which we're going to do on the call today, to show what bipartisan leadership looks like when it comes to protecting the freedom to vote. That starts with our leaders in Congress. Congress has to step up and get serious about federal proposals like the For the People Act, H.R. 1, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, H.R. 4. Let me close with this before I pass to our speakers to talk about the meaning of all of this. We have to remember elections are state phenomena, even when they have national impacts. Our states and our state leaders are at the front lines of the battle for voting rights. And while we are no strangers, no one on this call, neither the current and former officials, or I dare say the journalists, the many journalists who've joined us, are no strangers to doing our jobs in an environment presenting weakened federal protections for voting. Our local, state, and federal officials must be committed to using every tool available to make sure all eligible Americans can cast their ballots freely, fairly, and securely. And with that, let's hear from one of the great champions of that core principle of American democracy, Secretary of State Katie Hobbs. The Brnovich case was an Arizona case, so we're going to hear from her first on her perspective on the ground in Arizona. Secretary Hobbs.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Our country was built on the promise that our democracy would be reflective of our communities. Every eligible American should be able to cast a vote and have it counted. That doesn't change because of the decision yesterday, but instead, this should spark energy into those of us who care deeply about protecting the freedom to vote. This case was based on two Arizona provisions. As the chief elections officer in Arizona, I felt that these laws added discriminatory barriers to voting for Black, Latino, and Native American voters here in Arizona. And I made my case in the brief that I filed. Following this decision, the anti-democratic leaders who backed the lawsuit are trying to claim a win for election integrity. It's the same framing that they use to push other harsh voting restrictions, and as they back a sham review of the settled 2020 elections. An operation, by the way, that is so fraught with election security issues, it's going to cost Maricopa County $6 million to replace election equipment. But as we all know, what happens in one state doesn't stay that way. And this is what makes this moment so critical for leaders of all parties in all states and in Congress to protect every American's right to vote.
Thank you, Secretary Hobbs. And next, we will hear from the Nevada Attorney General, Aaron Ford. General?
Thanks, Norm. Great to see you, Secretary Hobbs and Governor Whitman. Thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion. Over the past 8 years, the court has chipped away at the very foundations of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That's a law that took years and cost people their lives to secure. And yesterday, they did so again. Similarly, so just about 8 years ago, I became an elected official in Nevada with the goal of making Nevada and our country a better place for our families and our communities. This included a commitment to protect the right of all communities to vote, no matter the zip code, without discrimination or intimidation. And now, as Attorney General, I remain steadfast in that commitment. The conservative Supreme Court is making that goal more challenging to achieve, but it's not up to the court what happens next. It's up to our leaders in Congress. It's up to the state and local officials. It's up to our business leaders. It's up to our activists. And it's up to us to determine what happens next. Here in Nevada, we are expanding access to the ballot box, and we're protecting the right to vote. In recent legislative sessions, our legislature has passed automatic voter registration and has expanded access to absentee voting. And to confront the sweeping attacks on the ballot box that we're seeing in states across the country, we must also amplify and celebrate the positive steps forward. We must continue to work together across state lines and across levels of government in our push to strengthen our democracy. Our leaders in Congress have an opportunity to make this a top priority. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the For the People Act are a great place to start. I find it interesting that today is the 57th anniversary of the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And what we have to continue doing is understanding the importance of all of these rights, especially the right to vote. What I want to allow to happen, because my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents were all from the South, and they all experienced regressive and discriminatory practices that disallowed them from the right to vote. I will not stand idly by and allow that to continue to happen. My children are depending on me, they're depending on us to continue pushing this forward. And during the 2020 election, leaders came together to keep voters safe, to make sure eligible voters were able to vote and that eligible votes were counted, and to defeat an unprecedented attack on our democracy. In Nevada alone, we defeated dozens of frivolous lawsuits. And this is another one of those times where it's an all hands on deck moment. I'm there.
Thanks, General Ford. And now my States United co-chair, where we pride ourselves on not only calling for bipartisanship, but modeling bipartisanship in the leadership of our nonpartisan organization. My wonderful co-chair and friend, Governor Christy Todd Whitman, over to you.
No, thank you, Norm, very much. And thank you to all the other speakers, because this is such an important time. I mean, this week's Supreme Court decision just continued this undermining of the longstanding protections of the right to vote. And it's followed by, it comes on the heels, actually, of 30 anti-voting right bills that have already become law, making it harder for voters to make their voices heard. It's unconscionable. And it's being done under the guise of ballot integrity, which is based on this premise that somehow this last election was fraught with fraud, when we know it wasn't. It was heard by 60 cases across the country by judges who were Republicans and Democrats, who found that there was no basis for these charges of fraud. Our debates on policy can be partisan. That's fine. That's what happens in our system. But the actual system that allows voters to be heard, to pick our leaders in our democracy, is not partisan. And we have to have Republicans and Democrats who care about democracy working together. We can't allow these sham audits on election results to continue, because they just undermine the public's feeling of security of these ballots. And this is really a critical moment for our country, because what we're seeing is something I don't believe we've ever seen before, certainly not to the extent that we've seen it. Our very elected officials who are trained and have been given our support to oversee our elections are being threatened, physically threatened. Poll watchers are being physically threatened and their families threatened. We can't allow this to go on. At the local leaders, we need better communication between the states and the local leaders to keep the voters and election administrators safe. In states across the country, we've got to continue to put pressure on our elected officials in our districts and states to protect the freedom to vote and push back on these dangerous policies that infringe on that right. This is where the private sector can come in because their voices have been heard once. And believe me, the elected officials respond to those voices. They need to keep up the pressure as well. And at the federal level, as you've heard, we need the Congress to get to work on protecting the vote. And they have these perfect opportunities in the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Act. As we head into the holiday weekend and we celebrate the 4th of July, all it makes this country so great. We remind ourselves that one of the principal underlying supports of that democracy is the right to choose our elected officials without fear, that every eligible voter has the right to step up and be heard. And that's why it's so great that at States United, we have so many strong pro-democracy people standing up who are both Republican and Democrat and independent, who are saying, we will fight to make sure that everyone who is eligible to vote has the right to vote and will be heard. Thanks a lot, Norm.
Thank you, Christy. And thank you for that battle plan of solutions to take down these escalating barriers, like the new hurdles that were stood up by the Supreme Court in the Brnovich case, to leap those hurdles, and through a combination of bipartisan state and federal work to deliver for democracy. I know some out there are wringing their hands, saying, oh, another obstacle. How will we ever overcome it? But everyone should remember that this wonderful coalition, and States United was very proud to be a part of it, this wonderful coalition across party lines in the states, where appropriate, supporting federal action, was successful in defending democracy and a peaceful presidential transition that was attacked and was violent for the first time in American history, succeeded in that awesome challenge in the 2020 election cycle. And it can be done again with the kinds of strategies. And if the hurdle is a little higher, we just got to run faster and jump higher to get over it. And that's what the states are going to do, representatives, irrespective of party. And I know Secretary Hobbs sees that with people like Maricopa County's Stephen Risher, very conservative individual, but boy, have he and the other individuals stepped up in Maricopa County, irrespective of party. So, so we come to you with hopeful that the country is going to rise to the occasion. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Fiona, who I think is going to open the floor up to questions. Fiona?
Thank you, Norm, and thank you, everyone. We have a few moments to take questions, so I'll just remind you, if you have a question, please feel free to put your name and your outlet in the chat, and I will make sure to unmute you to ask. I see, Tom, you have your hand raised, so I will unmute you now. All right, Tom, if you unmute yourself, you should be able to ask your question. All right, maybe no question there. I'll give it another minute if anyone has a question for our great speakers. And if not, that's all right. I know we are headed into a long holiday weekend. So thank you all so much for joining us. If you have any questions after the fact, please feel free to email us at press@statesuniteddemocracy.org. And I'd like to thank all of our panelists one more time for being here this morning and taking the time to talk about this very important decision.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Thank you, Aaron, Katie, Christy. Have a wonderful 4th of July. And I know I'm very grateful for our panelists and for everybody else who participates in States United, the wonderful nationwide coalition of current and former officials across the country who have joined us to make sure that the independence that we will be celebrating, one that is secured by over 2 centuries of progress towards democracy. We have not achieved the perfection that we strive for, and we never will, but we keep pushing forward. And that is the message that we will be celebrating at States United this 4th of July, how to fight for and make progress despite the challenges on free, fair, and secure voting for every eligible American. And we look forward to working together to do just that. Thanks, everybody. Happy 4th of July, and see you soon.
Thanks. Happy 4th.
Thanks, Norm. We'll celebrate the 4th of July the right way.
Bye-bye.
Hi, everyone.